Last week we looked at Beyond Reanimator, which, as an adaptation of a Lovecraft story, it was liberal with its source material to say the least. But today we'll be looking at a film that sticks to the story it's based on pretty closely. However, as we'll see, it all comes down to the execution. And ironically, flawed execution describes what happens in The Thing on the Doorstep pretty well. Welcome back to HP Lovecraft Month. The Thing on the Doorstep story was not exactly highly regarded. In fact, critics described it as formulaic, histrionic, and melodramatic. And one of the biggest reasons critics didn't like it is because it's a more mundane story as compared to Lovecraft's others of giant apocalyptic monsters of madness. But really, it's a little unfair to penalise the story because of what people expected Lovecraft to write. After all, he does have many lower concept stories that are just as compelling, if not more so, than the monster ones. So, with all that in mind, let's begin. The film begins in medias res as we hear gunshots and a man walking away. Hearing his narration, we know what just happened.
I have sent 6 bullets through the head of my best friend. And yet I hope to show by this statement that I am not his murderer.
That line is taken word for word from the story, and it does, for the most part, show how the film will be adhering to the source material. However, whether through budgetary reasons or just laziness, there is one detail about this film that makes its accuracy a big negative rather than a positive. Just bear with me and I'll explain what I mean in a moment. After the credits, the narration continues as we see our main character, Daniel Upton, typing his confession about his friend Edward Derby, and we learn a few interesting details about Edward. First, that he's well versed in the occult, but also his distinctive knock. In the story, it says Derby's knock is 3 brisk strokes followed by 2 more after a pause. It'll be important later, but why did the film change that? I know it seems like a minor detail, but that's just it. Why bother changing such a minor detail that is, ultimately, quite important? And speaking of changes, you might have noticed the big one by now. Back to the beginning of events, Derby visits Upton at home, casually asking his friend for a large amount of money. And can you see the issue here? Yeah. This film is set in modern day, with modern clothes and modern sensibilities. And why is that a problem, I hear you ask? Well, basically, the story revolved around people of the 1920s. So, affluent people who lived off their parents' fortunes, who had butlers and servants and chauffeurs, and who married each other after only a week of meeting. Not saying those things don't exist today. All I'm saying is they were more prevalent in the 1920s, and it's a little out of place today. Derby asks Upton for money to pay off a blackmailer, which in the story is merely a single sentence, but here it's given significance. And it's all to stop Derby's father from learning that Edward has been going to unusual parties at Miskatonic University. Another thing you'll notice, apart from the contemporary setting, is just how cheap it all looks. And that's not just because of budget, it's also because of skill, since the camera angles are terrible. Like here. Edward is the one talking, so why in the holy hell did they almost completely obscure him with a bowl in shot? Also, they clearly didn't have a lot of crew, as the camera is almost always locked off in one position. It all feels very student film. And I mean that in a very stereotypical way, because there are many student films better shot than this. Upton eventually writes Derby a check. We then meet Upton's wife, who's pregnant. By the time of the meat of the story, Upton had already had his child, so this is a lot of expanding on the little details about Upton and Derby's relationship before we get into the spookiness. We then get more narration of Upton typing, with this moment,
Case in point, the Blackmailer,
just looking like someone accidentally kicked the camera tripod. Upton goes to one of these Miskatonic parties, though it is to give Edward a drive home, and yes, pretty much everyone here is supposed to be a university student. I'll leave it up to you on whether that looks right. We do learn an interesting detail though, as one of the lecturers asks Upton if he can get a copy of Edward's book, Azathoth. Azathoth and Other Horrors, as it's called in the story, is Edward Derby's book of collected horror writings, leading many to suspect that Derby is based on Lovecraft himself. However, it's more likely he was based on Clark Ashton Smith, who wrote The Star Treader and other poems, which sounds similar to Darby's Azathoth and Other Horrors. He was possibly also inspired by Lovecraft's friend Alfred Galpin, who Lovecraft described as immensely my superior in intellect. Also in the story, Edward Derby has correspondence with Justin Jeffrey, which is a reference to another of Lovecraft's friends, Robert E. Howard, and his mythos-inspired story, The Black Stone. While chatting, Upton is also told about Asenath Waite, who's currently busy hypnotizing another woman. A red flag is immediately raised when she's said to be part of the Innsmouth Waites. And in fact, in the story, Asenath is described as dark, smallish, and very good-looking, except for her over-protuberant eyes, which is characteristic of people from Innsmouth, implying she's a Deep One hybrid. Although that fact about her appearance isn't really shown in the film. And honestly, Asenath in the film looks quite normal, and dare I say, boring. They could have given her some kind of gravitas. After all, this is the woman who is rumoured to be able to summon storms and cause any dog to howl with the motion of her hands. But there's just nothing here interesting. One fact, though, about her name. Asenath is an Egyptian name, meaning she belongs to her father, which, as we'll see, is incredibly appropriate. Speaking of names, one thing that's interesting is that the three principal characters, Edward Derby, Asenath Waite, and Daniel Upton, all reference other Lovecraft stories in some way. Asenath, with her connection to Innsmouth, Derby, with the middle name Pickman, references Pickman's model, but Daniel Upton also references Pickman's model because the titular character is named Richard Upton Pickman. Upton also learns about Asenath's father, Ephraim, who is said to be a student of the black arts, and that Asenath occasionally looks very much like him. All not so subtle references to the story's twist, and a biblical reference, because in the Bible, Asenath is the mother of Ephraim. During the ride home, Edward can't stop talking about Asenath, completely infatuated by her. Upton isn't so positive, but Edward and Asenath soon begin dating, and at Upton's house, Derby shows him a strange object that he says,
"She gave me this, so she can always be with me."
And when Upton stares into it, he gets a strange vision of a dark figure on a beach. No, it's not a Death Stranding crossover. Also, that object is never mentioned in the story, but as a vague reference to Asenath potentially being connected to something otherworldly, it works fairly well. And of course, Edward sees it as a romantic gift, but Upton can immediately see there's something wrong here. Edward is head over heels and is getting very impulsive with all the things he wants to do with Asenath, but Upton is the adult here, using his influence to tell him to calm down a bit, which Derby seems to listen to, for now. The next day, Upton is summoned by Edward's father, talking to him about Asenath, calling her a necromancer, witch, and Satan worshipper. So he clearly doesn't approve of the relationship. Daniel is confident it'll all blow over, but that's when he's told Edward and Asenath mean to get married, and soon. Upton remains confident that Edward will call it off, with the first mention of Edward's weak will and Asenath's strong will. But despite what he believes, Upton admits there's not much that can be done. It should be mentioned that at this point, Asenath hasn't actually done anything to make people not trust her. It's all just rumour and hearsay. All that's happened is Edward's father has gone, "I don't like this woman, stop my son marrying her." And Upton has said, "Yeah, I don't like her either." Which again is an attitude that would make so much more sense if this was set in the 1920s like it should be. Next, Upton and his wife are invited by Edward to a formal function, and he surprises them both by telling them it's because he just got married, although he doesn't look particularly happy about that. Upton speaks with Asenath, who weirdly is already making excuses for why she's not been seen out and about much, busy with the wedding and work and such. Upton then overhears a conversation outside between Asenath and the woman she hypnotized at the party earlier. We don't hear what it entails, but when the woman gets in her car, she ends up randomly dying, and even weirder, she drowned in salt water. The woman was pregnant, and Upton speculates on what Asenath might have wanted with the woman and her child. And you can probably tell that none of this is in the story, because it comes out of nowhere, goes away just as quickly, and just puts more suspicion on Asenath when it wasn't really needed. It's like the film got momentarily sick of its own slow pace. Many weeks later now, Edward has returned from his honeymoon to surprise Upton and his wife, giving his distinctive knock. Even though it's different from the story. Still annoyed about that. What's interesting about this conversation, Edward gives details about his married life, and all of it is from the story. But there, it was Upton's own observations. Yet in the film, Edward talks about how Asenath is a hypnotist by trade, how she has 2 incredibly old servants, and also...
and another strange girl who exudes the perpetual odor. Dead fish.
That fish line is another verbatim from the story. What should be noted, though, in the story, it's dead serious, but here, Edward plays it off like a joke, as in, he knows what he's saying is ridiculous, which tells me that the filmmakers knew what they were writing was ridiculous, but for some reason, whether they felt honour-bound or were just lazy, kept relatively close to the text when even they could see it needed to be changed, updated and adapted. Upton recalls, as he continues to write, Edward and Asenath's marital home, Crown and Shield, and how, although big and once grand, now it's a dilapidated husk, nearly falling apart. Ringing the doorbell, he's greeted by one of Asenath's servants, who sends Upton away pretty quickly. And you know, they could have cut that entire piece of dialogue from Edward and just have Upton now tell us what he thought of the place, the servants, and the particularly fishy odour, because that's what happens in the story. It feels like they felt the need to have more interaction between Edward and Upton, which is fine, but didn't write anything interesting, so just gave Edward some of Upton's lines from the story to read. It's starting to feel quite lazy, if you can't tell. Upton is greeted by his friend from the party earlier, and Upton mentions he saw Edward driving down Main Street, and how weird that is. He doesn't actually say why, though. It's because Edward can't drive, but that's not revealed. The friend also mentions that Edward and Asenath are starting to look alike. It's all very hint hint, wink wink, but it's not very subtle. But admittedly, it wasn't particularly subtle in the story either. Later in the evening, Edward is taken to Upton's house by his doctor, and inside, Edward talks about losing his identity. He also casually drops that his father is now dead. Upton's wife is close to giving up on Edward, and she suggests speaking with Asenath herself. I just want to talk about the actor playing Edward for a moment, because the character of Edward Derby goes through a lot of things in the story, and in order to make those things convincing, you need someone who can act them convincingly. And after the particularly mild incident we just saw from Edward, I don't have much hope that his acting is going to get any better. And that night, Upton gets more of the vision he saw earlier. Not much is conveyed, we just see Asenath freaking out in a bathtub. Upton then wakes, slowly walks around the room, gets a glass of water, and slowly goes back to bed. You know, I'm starting to think this movie is padded just a little bit. The next day, Upton's wife goes to speak with Asenath, and at Crown and Shield, she sees someone in the top window. Also, moaning can be heard. But it's so unconnected from the events, I can't tell if it's happening or just part of the soundtrack. She rings the doorbell, and Asenath's fishy servant says she isn't home. Of course, having just seen her in the window, that seems unlikely. Also, that disconnected moan audio was supposed to be coming from the house. But of course, the servant just angrily tells her to leave. However, in an impressive bait and switch, when Upton's wife gets back home, Asenath is there waiting for her, profusely apologising for the previous incident and how her servant acted, arranging a dinner party. Asenath says they can't have it at Crown and Shield, but Upton's wife insists. Also, because of the way it was shot, this is another time when the film is bad at conveying something, because like I said, it does look like Asenath is trying to pull some kind of trick, and make Upton's wife think she was in one place when she was elsewhere. But that's actually not the case. This scene takes place quite some time after the previous one. The next night, the Uptons get to Crowning Shield, and inside they're greeted by Asenath's other incredibly old servants, one of which paws at Upton's wife, and because she can't speak, the other servant translates, saying she wants to know about the baby, which is so weird and random everyone quickly moves on without even acknowledging them. At the table, Asenath asks about the baby herself and mentions how her father hated that she wasn't born a man. And in the back, Upton and Edward reluctantly talk. Edward thinks Asenath is constantly listening and watching him, so makes arrangements to explain things later. Upton's wife is looking for the bathroom upstairs and is again grabbed by the old servant. And because all that stuff with the servant and the baby is not in the story, the film moves on from it. It seems like the film needed to remind us that it was still a horror film with the cheap jump scare. Also, it doesn't have anything to do with anything because, quite simply, it can't, because that would require them to change the story, which they clearly don't want to do. In the car ride home, it's clear Upton's wife has really got the wrong end of the stick, because she thinks Edward is being abusive to Asenath and keeping her prisoner in the home. But in fairness, that is what Asenath wants her to believe. She's also been given another one of those crystals, but Upton quickly tosses it out the car after another quick vision. The next day, Asenath is waiting outside the Upton house with wrist marks, and she tells Upton's wife that he is trying to kill her, and the servants are helping him to do it. Upton's wife assumes she's talking about Edward, but she never actually mentions Edward. We then see strange visions of Asenath with a man's arm and her surrounded by papers, and while bandaging her arms, Asenath reveals she's been talking about her father, but also doesn't want to hear the name Asenath again. It's a little disjointed, but all these small revelations are playing out how they do in the story, except we're seeing them from slightly different perspectives and not just Upton's own. And I understand the filmmakers wanting to flesh things out a bit. After all, you can't have a film of nothing but narration. But they haven't done enough to make it a film. They've just chosen a few scenes to flesh out and kept the narration elsewhere, when it should have been a complete rewrite. Because as it is now, you get a lot of little scenes for one piece of information and then a ton of padding. A few days later, Upton and Edward are in the park, and Edward, with a load of documents, explains what's going on. Asenath has been switching bodies with him, and that she locks him in the attic to keep doing it. Edward needs to stop her as he runs off, leaving Upton with a single page, not really explaining much. Which is quite different to the story. The first time Upton learns this information is when he finds Edward delirious in a remote location, and he starts talking about shoggoths no less, as well as the body switching, so Upton just assumes that he might be insane. But here, it's just so matter of fact. I'm not saying Upton is more likely to believe him, but for the audience, it's just such a boring scene for such a big revelation. Upton gets home, and it turns out his wife has gone into labour, quickly rushing off to the hospital, and the baby is born all fine, but the film diverges again from the story because Upton names the baby after Edward's father. Which is weird, because this film has been trying to make the relationship between Upton and Edward more real and believable. So why not keep in the fact that Upton named the baby after Edward? It's just such a weird and pointless change that does the exact opposite in wanting to show that these men are close. Moving on from the baby, Upton asks his friend what he knows about the Waite family. He talks about Asenath's father, who near the end of his life had to be locked up in a padded room, and he died suspiciously just before Asenath started studying at Miskatonic. He also mentions that Ephraim Waite wrote in a strange symbolic language that was unable to be translated, and Upton shows him a piece of paper that was supposedly written by Asenath, showing the same handwriting, with one word being translated: immortality. Ooh, what could it possibly mean? Why is the film being all coy now? They've pretty much spilled the beans on what's happening with Edward. But I guess they still need to go through the motions of discovering the mystery, even though, let's be honest, there's not much mystery left. Upton's wife is determined to get inside Crowninshield, and while she does that bad idea, Upton and his friend have gone to none other than Innsmouth, and Asenath's childhood home, not finding much except a load of visions of Asenath as a child. The film doesn't really make it clear whether Upton is experiencing these particular visions. After all, he's the only character to experience visions throughout the film, so it's possible, but still left unclear. Back at Crowninshield, the attic where crying and moaning can be heard is investigated, and inside, Asenath is found tied to a chair, bloodied and crazy. And at the same time, the doors around Upton slam because houses in Innsmouth naturally respond when horror happens. And despite the very obvious horrible things she saw, Upton's wife takes it all very nonchalantly, telling Upton about Asenath being tied up. And why hasn't the police been called exactly? There's no way you can spin that incident as something perfectly fine to continue. But because this incident didn't happen in the story, there's nothing they can do, because it would mess with the film's story. And again, if this was a film set in the 1920s, what was happening would be far more believable. Not completely, but at least a little bit. But both Uptons pretty much resign themselves to not being able to do anything, even though they literally can. But anyway, the conversation is interrupted by a phone call from the sheriff saying Edward has been found, a raving lunatic, and Upton is asked to pick him up from the jail. After releasing him, Upton takes Edward to a motel, and this is that incident I mentioned earlier, where Edward tells Upton what's going on. But he's so crazy, it makes it difficult to believe. And of course, because he already did that earlier, when he wasn't so crazy, Upton doesn't believe Edward, even though he really should believe something by now. I can't tell you how disjointed this film is. It seems to me that the writer didn't understand the consequences of adding and moving scenes about without any care, because as you can see, it makes one hell of a mess. We do a partial recreation of the explanation scene in the story. Edward doesn't talk about seeing a Shoggoth, sadly, and really just repeats all the information we've already got. Asenath's taken his body. Asenath might not be Asenath. Eventually she'll take it permanently. Nothing new here. Edward, during his explanation, suddenly stops and changes demeanour, then insisting they go home. So it's clear Asenath took back control. Upton doesn't really notice till Edward volunteers to drive, and now Upton is starting to believe the story. Admittedly, despite Asenath, or perhaps Ephraim Waite, being very used to doing this, he's not very convincing. Even in the story, after Edward changes, he's like, "Forget about what I said, I was crazy and my wife's actually quite nice." After such a long time, you'd think he'd be a better liar. Or perhaps he feels he doesn't need to be convincing. He is literally in someone else's body after all. The film diverges once again as while driving, Edward takes back control, and in a flurry of terribly implemented Adobe After Effects, the car is crashed and Upton is injured. The film then devolves into a load of visions and images that doesn't really amount to much, and Upton wakes up in the hospital with his wife. The film quickly moves on from all of that, as a few weeks later has gone by without seeing Edward, so it's a surprise when he visits. He's round to collect some borrowed books, and his speech is very deliberate and not Edward. More importantly, Upton can tell the difference now between the real Edward and the entity inhabiting his body. The next time Edward visits, he delivers his distinctive knock, and Edward tells Upton that Asenath has now left him, and he makes sure that Upton won't say anything about their marital troubles. And once again, Edward exposits more details we already know. And that night, Edward is found skulking in the baby's room, scaring Upton's wife, and then screaming in his sleep. Edward has been going back to the now empty Crowninshield for some reason, as Upton finds him sitting in the dark, until one night, Upton receives a call from someone unknown, and the voice on the end is just gargles and whispers. But eventually, there's some thudding and shambling outside, causing Upton to investigate. And guess what? You know how the story and the film make a point of highlighting Edward's distinctive knock, and that's supposed to tell Upton that the thing on the doorstep is really Edward? Well, the film doesn't do it at all. In fact, unlike the story, Upton never even sees Edward on his doorstep handing him a note because he can't speak anymore. So just think about that. The very reason it's called the thing on the doorstep is completely omitted from the film entirely. I'm sorry. I've tried to be diplomatic with this film, but this is the worst possible thing you could do, and the final nail in the coffin for me ever recommending this. The rotting corpse that Edward now inhabits dies on Upton's lawn, and again the effect leaves a lot to be desired. They read the note that Edward left, which is pretty much the same as in the story. The note says Edward actually killed Asenath and walled her up in the basement, but that didn't stop the entity from getting to him. Asenath got Edward's body, and Edward got Asenath's corpse. But the film diverges again, because in the story, Edward was locked away in Arkham Asylum, and Upton just casually kills him there, but here, that doesn't happen. So there's a bit of a confrontation between the two men. Unfortunately, the actor playing Edward is just not good enough to be suddenly intimidating and a different person. So like the rest of the film, it's just so weak. But Upton doesn't shoot him just yet. He instead knocks Edward out and takes him to another location and then shoots him there. Even the shooting is needlessly padded. And thus the film ends where it began. Upton burns the body and leaves to write the ordeal down. And in a weird turn, where Upton has been writing this story down, he hears Edward's distinctive knock once again, before cutting to the credits. I'm just going to outright say it. This film is terrible. Written by people who thought they could improve upon the original story with their own additions, but all they did was make a muddled, padded mess of nothing interspersed with direct adaptation. A film isn't just its budget, but my god, this film just looks so damn cheap. It's not even trying to hide it. The effects are bad, yes, but you can tell this had minimal crew and resources. It's just so badly shot and produced. Yet honestly, those things could have been overlooked except for two important things. Firstly, the acting is beyond subpar. But even worse, they removed the entire point of the story. That's like removing Cthulhu from Call of Cthulhu. I would like to see the thing on the doorstep adapted well into a movie, but this really isn't it. I tried to give it the benefit of the doubt, but there's no other reason this film is bad other than plain and simple incompetence. Anyway, we're halfway through Lovecraft month, and it's been a mixed bag to say the least. But next week, the quality will be raised quite a bit, as we look at a film that's not an adaptation, but what I would consider a new addition to the mythos. Thank you so much for watching. I'd like to give a massive thank you to all my Patreon donators. Their support really does help a lot. And if you would like to contribute to the channel and gain access to the Deusdaecon Reviews Discord server, the link is in the description below. And if you would like to get more content aside from the reviews, please consider checking out the Twitch channel, where I stream live 5 days a week, 9 PM GMT, with subjects ranging from Let's Plays, discussions, movie watch-along nights, and even building this guy. The link is on the screen and in the description, so hopefully I'll see you there, and on YouTube, I'll see you next week.